Welcome back to The Explainer. Today, we're diving straight into one of the most agonizing, emotionally charged legal showdowns in South African history, the landmark 1996 AZAPO judgment. This case really forces us to look at the incredibly difficult, almost impossible choices a deeply divided society had to make just to secure a peaceful future.
Imagine for a second that the people responsible for brutalizing your family were suddenly just offered legal immunity. No jail time, no lawsuits, nothing. Would you grant a killer freedom if it meant finally getting the truth? That's the exact gut-wrenching moral dilemma at the heart of this case. The desperate need for national reconciliation clashing head-on with the deeply personal, undeniable right to see justice served in a court of law.
So to really grasp how this dilemma ended up before the Constitutional Court, we have to look at the timeline. We're talking about a fragile transition out of decades of deep, violent conflict. Things started to really escalate around 1960, and honestly, the country just hemorrhaged dangerously for years. By the early 90s, leaders on all sides realized they were on a total disaster course. That realization led to the 1993 Interim Constitution, which eventually birthed the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, the TRC, in 1995, aiming to somehow uncover the truth of those dark decades.
But, this transition wasn't smooth. It hit a massive legal roadblock almost immediately.
The Azanian People's Organization, along with the families of murdered anti-apartheid activists, including the Biko, Muxenge, and Ribeiro families, took their profound grief straight to the Constitutional Court. Their argument? They said granting amnesty was a direct violation of their fundamental constitutional rights. Specifically, they pointed to Section 22 of the Interim Constitution, which guarantees everyone the right to have disputes settled in a court of law. For these families, that meant the right to see murderers prosecuted criminally and the right to sue them for civil compensation.
And what's truly staggering about the TRC Act is that it completely wiped the slate clean. Once someone was granted amnesty, that was it. Criminal liability? Gone. No prosecution, no prison time. Civil liability? Also gone. You couldn't personally sue them for damages, and, incredibly, the state itself was shielded from being sued for the actions of its employees. The applicants argued this effectively obliterated their right to justice.
So how on earth did the Constitutional Court justify stripping away these fundamental rights?
Well, it all comes down to the Constitution's epilogue. Justice Muhammad, who wrote the leading judgment, beautifully cited this epilogue, calling the new laws a literal historic bridge. A bridge spanning from a violently unjust past straight toward a shared democratic future. The court determined that this epilogue carried the exact same legal weight as the rest of the Constitution, which meant Parliament was actually authorized to limit individual rights to court if it served the purpose of building this bridge.
The architects of this transition had to make a seriously tough, deliberate choice. They chose to prioritize national understanding over individual vengeance. The ruling explicitly points out that if the Constitution had kept the door open for continuous retaliation, the agreement to transition to democracy probably never would have been reached. The bridge would have remained completely unstable, constantly threatened by fear from the old regime and anger from the victims.
It's really all about this incredible concept, a need for Ubuntu, but not for victimization. They knew the nation couldn't just magically snap into unity after decades of terror. They had to actively, consciously, choose a legal framework that stopped the cycle of retaliation, even if it meant sacrificing traditional punitive justice.
Which brings us to a huge question. Why not just demand the truth and then prosecute them?
It sounds simple, right? But without the absolute ironclad incentive of amnesty, the perpetrators were never going to talk. As the judgment notes, the brutality was totally shrouded in secrecy. Records were destroyed. Witnesses were terrified or dead. The only way survivors were ever going to find out what happened to their loved ones, where they were buried, who actually gave the orders, was by giving the perpetrators an undeniable reason to confess. Amnesty was literally the price paid to unlock the truth.
Now, I want to be clear here. This wasn't just some blanket amnesia. The law didn't automatically let everyone off the hook. Perpetrators had to meet very strict, carefully weighed legal thresholds to walk free. They had to step into the light and make a full disclosure of every relevant fact. On top of that, the act had to be tied to a political objective, and the violence used had to be strictly proportional to that objective. If a perpetrator acted out of personal greed or malice, absolutely no amnesty for them.
The court also looked outward, noting impartially that South Africa definitely wasn't alone in doing this. They referenced similar transitions in places like Chile, Argentina, and El Salvador. In all these nations, truth commissions were used to try and prevent history from repeating itself. The court pointed out that international law doesn't universally demand the prosecution of human rights violators when a sovereign state is just trying to put itself back together after an internal conflict.
But even with those precedents, there was another massive point of contention in this ruling.
It's one thing to let an individual walk free, right? But why grant the state immunity from civil lawsuits? The applicants had a really compelling point. If the perpetrators are immune, shouldn't the victims' families at least be able to sue the state for what its apartheid-era employees did? The court acknowledged the immense weight of this argument, but they had to ask a brutally difficult question. If the new, democratic state spends its limited budget paying massive civil claims to the individuals who actually have the resources to bring lawsuits, who gets left behind?
Decades of systemic apartheid had left the country dealing with widespread poverty, malnutrition, and illiteracy. The state's resources were stretched incredibly thin. Lawmakers had to make a nearly impossible choice. They chose to funnel those funds into rebuilding society for everyone, building schools for the young, housing for the homeless, and providing primary health care, rather than directing that exact same money to settle civil claims. The court ruled that Parliament was constitutionally permitted to make this agonizing choice for the greater good of national reconstruction.
Ultimately, the court had to weigh everything neutrally.
They had to balance the profound, undeniable pain of the individual victims against the sheer survival of the nation itself. And they anchored their final conclusion in that powerful philosophy of Ubuntu. The judgment determined that the amnesty law, as imperfect and deeply painful as it was a constitutional necessity to secure a peaceful future. It was an acknowledgement that survival depended on interconnectedness and compassion, replacing the unyielding demands of traditional law with a wider vision of societal healing.
So, as we wrap up this explainer, I want to leave you with this final provocative thought. When a nation is completely shattered by trauma and division, is securing a fragile peace worth sacrificing the absolute legal right to punish the guilty? The Constitutional Court decided it was the only way forward, but man, the weight of that choice absolutely still resonates today. Thanks for joining me on this deep dive into the Azapo judgment. Catch you next time.